right, Caitlin.
All right.
Yeah, take it away.
We've got everybody joining us. Awesome. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for being with us today to talk about community wildfire resiliency plans. It seems a little bit ironic that we're dealing with one of our biggest flood scenarios that we've ever had out here in the regional district, and we're talking about fires tonight. But it's just another one of those things that highlights it's a reality in our area. And so I'm really glad to have Matt Shields here today to talk to you about the community wildfire resiliency plans that we're working on. And he's going to go through kind of what those plans are and what we're kind of learning about the Area F and what its wildfire kind of potential looks like, and some of the resolutions that we might be able to come up with in the future that you might see in this community wildfire resiliency plan. So Matt, I'll let you take it away. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay. So thank you for joining, everyone. So as Caitlin explained, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about this process to develop a community wildfire resiliency plan for Electoral Area F. Before we get going, I just wanted to acknowledge that this project takes place on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Snuneymuxw, Nanos, Qualicum, and Relations. And I'm joining tonight from the traditional unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in Vancouver. Like Caitlin mentioned, I'm going to first start off with giving you a brief refresher on what one of these plans even is, if you missed our community open house in August. Then I'm going to talk about some of the findings about wildfire risk for Electoral Area F. And then lastly, the third part of the presentation is I'm going to talk about how the CWRP can support Fire Smart in Electoral Area F. So what sorts of things might be in the plans. And I'm hoping that the presentation is going to take us about 30 minutes to leave lots of room for questions.
Just thought I'd jump in as well. I know there are some internet issues that everybody's been having too today, so we will be recording this presentation. And if we do have any issues with things dropping out, we'll be able to provide another recording of this that's a little bit more smooth for us later that we can watch, and you guys can provide questions.
Thanks, Caitlin. All right. So what is a community wildfire resiliency plan anyways? So community wildfire resiliency plans are adopted by local government. So in this case, the Regional District of Nanaimo, and they map wildfire risk around communities and propose recommendations to reduce that wildfire risk. The plans are paid for through provincial government grants, and what you get at the end is a high-level strategy for managing wildfire risk in your community in the form of a document accepted by the Regional District Board. And it looks something like this. And these are excerpts from one of my company, Diamond Head's recent community wildfire plans in the Sunshine Coast Regional District, just across the Strait of Georgia from you guys. And these plans are meant to be read by the public, and they're going to place wildfire risk in your area in the context of the local landscape, community values, and other features of your community. The plans provide strategic advice on how the Regional District in Nanaimo can manage wildfire risk. And we'll talk more about those recommendations that the plan can make towards the end of the presentation. But I wanted to get across here that you should be thinking of the plan as a first step towards building a fire smart community. So it leaves lots of room for the Regional District to tailor risk management to local circumstances and interests, and the plan acts as a key to more provincial funding for fire risk management. So how do we make one of these things? Well, it starts with a review of your community's context, its weather, its fire history, environmental and cultural values. Then we make site visits to public parks and other lands to assess potential wildfire behavior, validate provincial data, and look at public infrastructure. And following that, we do a bit of analysis, some mapping work to model wildfire risk on public lands. And then finally, we make recommendations about how to manage that risk, as I mentioned. And we're still at the point where we're developing recommendations. So during the question and answer, if you have any thoughts or suggestions about where we should take this, then we're all ears, and we look forward to hearing from you. Okay, so let's touch on some of that background info. So I don't have time to go through all the material that will be in the plan, but it includes population and area statistics, growth trends in your community, information on parks, the environment and natural landscape, and then also climate and weather data, including a consideration of climate change. So I don't need to tell you that Electoral Area F contains an amazing diversity of communities and places, from the giant trees of Cathedral Grove to friendly faces at places like Arrington Farmers Market. But something that we all share is the communities are forest communities. And this means that almost all of us live within an area called the Wildland Urban Interface. And this is the area mapped in orange on the map. It's determined by the province, and it forms a buffer around areas of higher population. And that wildland urban interface, that orange line, is really important for managing wildfire risk because, firstly, it's where most people live and most infrastructure is located. Secondly, it's where homes directly meet forest vegetation. And thirdly, it's where there are the most sources of ignition. So about those sources of ignition, one piece of the background I want to bring to your attention is the recent fire history in Electoral Area F. We know that fire is part of the ecological history of most coniferous forests in North America. Before colonial settlement, large natural fires may have occurred as frequently as once every 150 to 200 years in our area, and fire was also used extensively by Indigenous people along the coast for reasons like promoting camas and game forage. Pre-colonial fire history is an area of active research, and for our project, we considered where locals have told us fires occurred and also looked more closely at data maintained by the BC Wildfire Service. So the map that you see is showing two pieces of that data from the BC Wildfire Service. And the first is the polygons or the shapes. So those pink and red blotches on the map, they represent larger fires in the province's database, typically larger than 1 hectare in size. A hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters, just so you know. And these records are available from 1919 to 2020, so 100 years. The lighter colors are fires that occurred before 1950, and these total 61 fires. There have been 5 larger fires after 1950, and this is the rust color that you can see in certain places on the map, like near Cameron Lake. The 2 most recent of these later fires occurred after 2000 and are too small to see on this map. Okay, so that was one piece of data. The second piece of data are the red dots. So the red dots show the province's data on smaller fire starts between 1950 and 2020, so the last 70 years. There are a lot more of them than the larger fires, as you can probably tell. 470 to be precise were reported to the BC Wildfire Service during this period, and of these 215 spread to surrounding forests and had to be actively fought. Generally, there have been between 20 to 30 fires requiring fighting per decade. So I just want to draw out some conclusions or some observations from this map for you. So what you can see is that almost all of the large wildfires occurred before 1950. Recall that that's the lighter colored areas on the map. While ignitions in recent decades are mostly small fires that were quickly suppressed or burned out due to unfavorable conditions. And these are indications that local firefighters are doing a good job of fire suppression as well as advocating for fire safety. I know that human-caused ignitions is a significant concern in your communities, and the stats also bear that out. 85% of the fire starts can be attributed to human causes, and only 3% were caused by natural causes like lightning. A number of fires, of course, are of unknown cause. Locals have told us that there are a variety of concerns, including illegal campfires and unattended fires on rural property. I also briefly wanted to touch on climate change. As we know, global greenhouse gas emissions are causing changes in the Earth's atmosphere. Around Western North America, research has shown an increasing fire season length on average. In our region, observed and predicted climate change show that we may have hotter, drier weather in the summer and for a longer part of the year. Rainfall is predicted to increase in winter, spring, and fall, and it may increase slightly in summer, but likely not enough to offset the effect of warmer temperatures. So all in all, these changes are likely to support increased wildfire activity. However, in a particular year, fire potential is very strongly influenced by the in-season weather that we experience, and this is difficult for models of climate change to predict. So we can't be certain what the future will look like. In particular, precipitation volumes and distribution have large effects on fire season weather, and these outputs are some of the least certain from standard climate models. Another piece of information we can consider is past climate change. We know that our region has had warm and cold periods since the end of the last ice age, and during warm periods, charcoal records show that fire was a lot more regular here than it is now. Overall, we should acknowledge that risk may increase over time, and this is one reason that community wildfire planning is a cyclical process meant to be repeated as communities and forests change. Okay, and then lastly, there's one more context piece that I want to address before we talk about the wildfire risk analysis, and that's land ownership in our community. So the blacked out areas on the map that I'm showing now are private land. And as you can see, the majority of our communities are privately owned and public land is a minority. This is especially true in Hilliers, Coombs, and Arrington, where there's very little contiguous public land. Under the terms of our project's funding, we can't assess wildfire threat on private land due to privacy concerns. And during our site visits, we only looked at public land. In the next section of the presentation, we'll only show wildfire risk on public land. But because we know much of the private land on the island is forested, it's important to recognize that wildfire risk doesn't stop at a parcel boundary. The abundance of private land in our community affects how we respond to wildfire risk. Okay, so our site visits. These had a couple of purposes. And the first was to visit forests in the vicinity of homes and communities and make wildfire threat assessments there. More on this process in just a second. The second was to visit pieces of infrastructure that could be important for emergency response, like fire halls, water infrastructure, and communications towers. And the third was to see a wide variety of areas to understand the form of development in different neighborhoods. So let's talk a little bit more about the wildfire threat assessments. These helped us develop updated maps of wildfire risk. So there I am. The wildfire threat assessment process, this is the backbone of the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan. We conducted these during July and August to inform the mapping of updated wildfire risk. So the wildfire threat in wildfire threat assessments refers to the potential of a forest to ignite and support fire. So wildfire threat combines three elements, and they are topography, forest fuels, fire weather, and topography. Wildfire threat is rated for different forests as very low, low, moderate, high, and extreme. And you can think of these ratings as being somewhat like a rating of flammability. The threat ratings don't specifically take into account the likelihood of ignition. All forests from low to extreme require a spark before they burn in a wildfire. Okay, so the components. The relationship between topography, weather, and fire is fairly straightforward. Steeper forested slopes allow more rapid fire spread and intense fire behavior because of the simple fact that hot air rises. So fire at the bottom of a slope is preheating the forest above it, evaporating moisture from the forest and licking further up into tree crowns as it gets a leg up, so to speak, from the slope. As for weather, the longer a hot, dry period, the easier it is for a fire to start because more and more of the forest's moisture will have evaporated. Winds stoke fire like a bellows and can lead to rapid fire growth. And the best weather conditions for a fire to start and grow are on a breezy day at the end of a long, hot drought. Forest fuels are a bit more complicated in their relationship to fire behavior. When we talk about forest fuels, we are simply talking about the wood, branches, leaves, needles, shrubs, herbs, organics in the soil, and other biomass that can catch on fire and burn. So there are several traits that we use to characterize forest fuels, and don't worry about writing these down. When making our threat assessments, we look at all of these common terms in our forest fuels glossary. These traits tend to vary at the scale of a forest stand, an area of similar forest cover, usually sharing a common origin, such as a wildfire or a windstorm. Concepts like surface fuel, ladder fuel, and crown fuel describe the different parts of the forest and their role during a wildfire. Fuel strata gap and crown closure tells us how far apart these pieces are. Thanks, Diane. I just see your comment about your internet connection. And we'll make sure that we reach out to you, okay? So I was just describing, so measures of density, like stems per hectare, can be used to assess overall fuel volumes of living dead or even fallen trees. And tree species also influence fuel characteristics because coniferous trees are broadly more active during wildfire than deciduous trees. But the most important concept in our glossary to understand is the fuel type, that last one. So fuel types represent common patterns we see in the other forest fuel characteristics. Every forest in Canada can be described as one of 16 fuel types developed by the Canadian Forest Service. In British Columbia, the BC Wildfire Service has adapted this system to describe BC's great diversity of forests. And so to help you make it through Fuel Types 101, I'm going to give just 3 notes. Okay, the first note is coniferous trees and forests are more flammable than deciduous, all things being equal. The second note is for conifers. Denser forests are usually more flammable than less dense forests. And the third point is forests with a lot of small young trees are usually more flammable than forests with a lot of big old trees. Now, these rules are not absolute, but they give you the basics you need to start looking at forests and fire behavior around your community. So this map is showing you the most common fuel types in Electoral Area F. We have several. So on this map, orange colors show areas of coniferous dominated forest. That's forests of Douglas fir, western red cedar, pine, and other species. The C5 fuel type, as it's called, is shown in peachy orange. This is the most common coniferous fuel type. This fuel type represents coniferous forests of moderate density, mostly made up of middle to old age trees, particularly Douglas fir. These forests are typically associated with moderate wildfire threat. Next, these darker areas of orange, we also have the C3 fuel type. This represents coniferous forests of higher density with more continuity between fuel layers. These fuel types in our area are often relatively young. These forests are typically associated with higher wildfire threat. Pine is more characteristic of these stands, although Douglas fir trees can form them in some cases. And we saw several areas around the electoral area where pine was a minority component of other coniferous stands, which may increase wildfire threat there as well. And lastly, these other areas that you see in pink and magenta, these represent a mix of forests all containing at least 25% deciduous trees. So these mixed or pure deciduous forests are often held to have reduced wildfire threat because of the lower number of conifers. So fire behavior in the mixed wood stands can vary widely with the proportion of conifers and their distribution. So you heard me use the word typically just now in my description of wildfire threat and fuel types. And this is because variability within forests, topography, and the effects of weather all combine to make wildfire threat. So wildfire threat, you'll recall, is a kind of probability that tells us how severe a fire could be under typical conditions. And fire rank is a visual classification, on the other hand, used by the BC Wildfire Service to help us understand the kinds of fire that can occur. So the higher the fire rank, the less predictable, faster spreading, and more dangerous the wildfire. Beyond rank 3, fires are often too difficult to directly fight with ground crews and must be extinguished by air support or favorable weather. The likelihood of higher rank fires tends to increase with more flammable fuel types and more extreme fire weather, such as hot drought or extended drought, high temperatures and high winds. And one way of thinking about this is that it is easier, so to speak, for an area of higher extreme wildfire threat to sustain a fire of higher rank than for a moderate threat area to do so. And I just want to draw your attention to crown fires. Crown fires are those where the fire is burning into crown fuels, that is the needles and branches in the upper part of the tree. And these fires can send off large numbers of embers, burn with high intensity, and are major threats to nearby communities. Despite this, fire of any rank in the interface is capable of threatening homes and public safety if uncontrolled. So to put it together, the wildland-urban interface is where wildfire threat becomes wildfire risk. Risk is when there's something of value that could burn down because of a wildfire. How specifically does wildfire threat become wildfire risk? Well, fires have three ways of spreading from forests into communities. So the first is direct flame, and this is when your home is exposed to wildfire by the ignition of its landscaping, yard debris, or other things that you have stacked up around the building. Second is radiant heat. A fire front can generate a lot of energy. If your home is within 10 to 30 meters of a forest on fire, the heat from the blaze can be enough to cause materials on your home to ignite. And the greatest risk of this occurring is within 10 meters of your home. And thirdly, there's ember ignition. So a fire can send off embers or firebrands that ignite flammable materials well in advance of its arrival. And embers can lodge in the crevices of your roof or siding or ignite landscaping near your home. And while embers can travel up to several kilometers ahead of a fire, the greatest risk is within a few hundred meters of a burning forest. So when fires with higher threat ratings are within a few hundred meters of homes, we recognize higher wildfire risk. So to actually map risk in your community, we combined weather, fuels, and topographic information with information on the location of homes in the wildland urban interface. To read these maps, you just need to understand that areas that are light blue have very low expected wildfire behavior. You have the light yellow areas showing low wildfire threat. Then that neon yellow color is moderate. Orange is high, red is extreme. And if you happen to pick up on the hash anywhere, that denotes a high risk area where there's a higher extreme wildfire threat that is close to homes. So in the east part of Electoral Area F in Coombs and Arrington, almost all the areas of public land have moderate wildfire threat and risk. And there are minor areas of high risk that are mostly driven by small pockets of those denser coniferous fuel types, the C3s. So in the western part of Electoral Area F, the situation is a little bit different. So we have a significant high-risk area, both around Whiskey Creek and Meadowood. So the higher risk areas south of Meadowood subdivision are associated with coniferous forests on extremely steep slopes. Okay, Caitlin, I can try that. I'm getting a note that I should maybe turn my video off just to make sure that the connection's as good as it can be here. So just bear with me a second. Caitlin, you guys can still see the presentation? Is that right? Okay. Sorry about that, folks. I think I might be the problem tonight. So I hope this presentation is coming through okay. Right, so I was discussing the wildfire risk in the western part of Electoral Area F. So that area of high risk south of Meadowood is associated with mostly C5 fuel types on very steep slopes. So the slopes that are south facing down into Cameron Lake. So slope strongly is expected to strongly influence fire behavior in this area and may allow more severe fire under typical fire season weather conditions. Now, around Whiskey Creek, so that high and extreme threat area, the orange and red, you can see several patches, and these areas differ. So on the west side of Whiskey Creek, to the left of where I've named the community there, that is an area of these younger coniferous fuel types, these C3s. And then on the east side of Whiskey Creek, where you see sort of a couple isolated patches of red, those are areas marked as recently harvested in the province's vegetation data. And we didn't actually have time to visit all of these locations to confirm fuel loading. But in almost all cases, recently harvested areas are subject to a process called post-harvest wildfire hazard abatement. That means that they have to be cleaned up to an acceptable level. So the threat in these polygons may be overestimated. Southwest of Whiskey Creek, however, these areas are coniferous fuel types, those younger coniferous fuel types that I mentioned, and we do expect that higher threat showing there to be a good representation based on our site assessments. Okay, so some key takeaways from those two slides. So moderate threat is typical. And moderate threat means that many people live in communities where wildfire is possible during extreme fire weather conditions, even if the highest ranked fires are unlikely. Secondly, private land severely fragments the forest landscape, making it difficult to gain a complete picture of the risk environment. And this is especially true in Coombs and Arrington. And thirdly, high risk around Whiskey Creek is related to fuel types. Although this risk should moderate over time, fuel management may be feasible in this area to reduce risk. High risk south of Meadowood is controlled by slope, and there may be more limited potential to manage fuels in this area due to lower feasibility. As another capstone to this sort of discussion of risk, I just wanted to point out that just because something is low risk doesn't mean that fire could never happen there. And just because an area is extreme risk doesn't mean that fire will definitely happen there. Fires require ignitions, favorable weather, and fuel. Risk reflects probability and not certainty. So in the interface, almost everyone can benefit from thinking about fire smart if they haven't already. Okay, so that's the end of our little discussion on risk. And this last part of the presentation is focused on some of the things that we can consider doing about it. So like I mentioned off the top, the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan is going to make recommendations for the regional district to manage wildfire risk in Electoral Area F. And these recommendations will follow the 7 disciplines of Fire Smart I've listed on the slide. And so in the following section of the presentation, I pulled out some high-level ideas that we are considering for the plan in your area. I've split them into education, community planning and development, emergency response, and fuel management topics. Most of these actions are eligible for additional provincial funding if supported by the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan. Okay, so education. So public education and outreach play a critical role in helping communities prepare for wildfire by promoting a sense of empowerment and shared responsibility. Recommendations in this section of the plan will focus on what the regional district can do to improve awareness of wildfire in your community and increase resources and participation in Fire Smart by members of the public. So the plan will aim to align the regional district with the good outreach and organizing around fire prevention already happening. For example, the regional district could install wildfire awareness signage or educational material in popular park locations like trailheads in Little Qualicum River and Englishman River Regional Parks. Popular recreational areas are high traffic, high visibility locations where people are already going to think about forests. So this is a good opportunity to connect the dots between forests and fire. Another thing, currently Dashwood Fire Department has a Fire Smart coordinator who liaises with community members in Meadowood about prevention and preparedness and conducts home assessments to help residents understand where the risk to their home comes from. So the regional district could investigate ways to provide this service for residents south and east of the Little Qualicum River, perhaps by coordinating a joint grant application for a new Fire Smart coordinator role to be shared between the Coombs and Arrington fire departments. Another way the regional district could promote wildfire awareness and education is by organizing a community cleanup day for wildfire. So these community cleanup days are typically focused on cleaning up of a smaller high-use park or public facility. And these days can be great opportunities to demonstrate Fire Smart landscaping principles to local residents who can get hands-on experience identifying and removing problem vegetation. And places like Arrington Community Park and Meadowood Community Park are well located for this kind of activity, being central to their communities. Okay, so then we have community planning and development. So community planning and development recommendations address how the regional district conducts its own business, including park and infrastructure management. The regional district could initiate several changes to how communities are planned, ranging from making sure large development proposals are reviewed by local fire departments to large public processes to revise the official community plan. A good place to start may be by ensuring Fire Smart information goes out with every development application. To begin to understand the risk on private land, the regional district could work to incorporate wildfire hazard assessments as required information for large development approvals in interface areas like big subdivision applications. And in the future, with public support, the regional district may be able to update subdivision and development rules so that fire smart building is prioritized, though this would require community consultation and support. The regional district may be able to influence wildfire risk in your community through its park management. So the regional district could adopt internal policies to make sure parks, regional district property, and its own facilities are being constructed and maintained with fire smart materials and landscaping. For new parkland or property acquisitions, the regional district could adopt policy to assess wildfire hazard at or before the time of acquisition or lease. And the regional district can also access additional money to conduct fire smart assessments of its own critical infrastructure. We've also heard that community members who want to fire smart their properties are looking for a way to dispose of waste material. So the regional district might be able to access additional funding from the province for providing a dumpster, a chipper, waiving tipping fees, or providing curbside pickup for this purpose. So the plan will likely recommend that the regional district staff develop a costed plan for waste disposal on a scheduled community chipping day. So next up, enhancing emergency response. So recommendations in this topic area address how the regional district can integrate wildfire risk into its internal emergency preparedness. So the regional district can lead the update of emergency and evacuation plans, ensuring that each are adequate for community and neighborhood size. Internal policy can promote review of the plans when new large developments take place. In the long term, the regional district can plan strategically for secondary access to several single access neighborhoods south of Highway 19, and there may be potential in the future to obtain rights of ways for such routes through future subdivision. The regional district can continue to liaise with local firefighters. During this project, we heard from firefighters that they are interested in seeing additional capacity for fire smart education, as well as updates to some aspects of the regional district's community planning. The regional district can work with fire departments not currently served by a fire smart coordinator to ensure that residents have access to this fire smart resource and are able to quickly and easily get their homes assessed anywhere in Electoral Area F. And the regional district can also bring more voices to the table by, for example, establishing a working group with local fire departments, the BC Wildfire Service, the regional district's Parks Department, and BC Parks representatives to address priority fuel management projects in the interface. So the last topic area addresses fuel management. So in some areas on public land, it may make sense to pursue. And fuel management, if you are not already aware, is when a professional forester makes detailed site assessments of fuel loading in an area and develops a prescription to reduce components of the forest that are creating risk. So these assessments are more detailed and intensive than the data we collected for the CWRP and can be used to model fire behavior and intensity at specific sites. So the photos on this slide are showing you a post-treatment condition. So this is after a fuel management treatment was done in these areas. And these are Douglas fir forests similar to the forests we have in Electoral Area F. And the point being is that in most cases, the purpose of fuel management is to keep a forest in place, not to clear cut it. So the regional district is currently planning fuel management in the 707 Community Park on Gabriola Island, for example. In that location, high density conifer forest is contributing to high wildfire threat near homes. And you can find out more about this and other projects on the regional district's Get Involved page where you registered for this event. The 707 Park Fuel Management Project will have another public event like this one, an online Zoom event, where you can learn more about this aspect of wildfire risk management. So it's critical to understand that fuel management typically targets smaller or dead trees, not large healthy ones. Fuel management is a tool that we can use in some situations to reduce the likelihood of fire spreading towards homes and improving the chances of suppression success. So how this will come up in the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan is that the plan will identify potential treatment areas on the basis of their wildfire risk rating, site assessments, their proximity to homes, their operational feasibility and usefulness. So high priority areas for investigation for this process are near the Whiskey Creek and Meadowood subdivisions in those high threat areas that you saw in the risk maps. Okay, so to wind down a little bit here, so while the planning process is ongoing, you can submit questions and find more information at that Get Involved page for wildfire resiliency. That's getinvolved.rdn.ca, and just search for wildfire. In the new year, we will be having another event to present to you the highlights of the CWRPs for each electoral area, so F and the other 6 electoral areas, before they go to the regional board. And this event will be online, similar to this webinar. We're aiming to have the plan for your community in place by February 2022, when it will go before the Regional District Board in a public meeting. So that concludes my presentation. So now we have time to take any questions that anybody might have. I think it's a pretty small group of us today. I just need to check back in on the video to see how many people are left here. So I'm not sure that we'll need to use the raise hand feature or anything like that, depending on how many of you there are. But if you do want to help us let us know that you have a question, then feel free to click away and you'll show up high up in the order of speakers here. And we can start answering some questions. And Caitlin, did you want to have any say any remarks before we get going here?
Matt, I think we just lost the last of what you said, but I think we do have a couple of questions running, and we'll do our best to answer them, but we will also write down the questions, and if there's something that you don't quite catch correctly, we can always shoot some emails back and forth to make sure you have all the information you're looking for.
Yes.
So
yeah, before we get started, I do, I'm so sorry if it seems that maybe it's my internet connection that seems to be the problem here. I'm not sure why, but I just sorry about that, everyone. If you weren't able to hear the presentation, we will make the recording available, and hopefully you'll get some answers that way. But yeah, Karen, did you have a question? Do you want to go ahead?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I live in Meadowood, and Meadowood in this whole area F is quite unique in that it is, everybody else is on the opposite side of the river from us. Yeah. And I wonder in the plan if this area is being treated any differently, or is it all being rolled into one as if it was all a continuous area?
So basically there will be one plan for the whole electoral area, but within the plan, we did visit individual communities. So I've been to Meadowood and was able to visit your community with members of the Dashwood Fire Department, actually, to sort of try and get a better sense of some of the issues that you guys face. So there will be some amount of specific recommendations to each community. So it'll be one plan. You won't get your own document, but there should be some recommendations that are specific to your area. That said, the planning process is pretty high level. So a lot of the actions are going to be strategic. They may not be sort of the detail or of the level of detail that you maybe are expecting, but they will be enough to sort of allow the regional district to sort of move forward in specific areas. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I just got like a note from Diane that talks about landscaping. And Matt, can you maybe comment on how we think about landscaping in some of these plans? And then I can always comment too on some of the documentation that we already have in place and some of the processes that we can work with.
Yeah. So is the question about fire smart landscaping on private property?
It's more about how landscaping and development need to be addressed. Yeah. So why don't you start with that, and then I can comment more on like the fire smart landscaping part.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So as far as so landscaping during development, I think Diane, if you raise that question, it's a really good one. So the regional district's ability to regulate or influence development is a really important way in the long term to build a fire smart community. Currently, there aren't a lot of provisions in the bylaw that relate to wildfire hazard. By the bylaw, I mean the zoning and development bylaw that applies to Electoral Area F. I forget what number it is, but the one that says what your zoning is and what you're able to build on each lot and what a subdivision has to look like. So there isn't a ton of guidance right now. So it's possible some very quick fixes that the regional district, I think, is going to be considering are things like making sure that information about fire smart landscaping and fire smart design goes out with every development application, as I mentioned. That's something that can be done without changing the bylaw at all. And then from there, we start to walk into territory that gets a bit trickier because we would need to presumably have some kind of public process to amend a bylaw so that there were new requirements for landscaping in a fire smart way. And to do that, obviously, we would need wholesale community support from all the different communities. So that's not something that we can do quite as quickly, but it is something that we will talk about in the plan as a potential action. So some things that can be done are to influence the way that subdivisions are designed. So lot layout during subdivision is just an example of something that can be really important for setting basically the distance between new homes and adjacent forest vegetation. If we get in a subdivision plan, some rules that say, on this edge, the developer has to remove these conifer trees before they can start construction on these new homes. That's one way that in the future, it might be possible to help manage the risk in some of these interface areas. Yeah, but most of these changes would have to go through, a public process to amend your zoning and development bylaw, if not the official community plan. There are other options in the official community plan that relate to specifically regulating development in areas of high hazard. And I can talk about that a little bit if you're interested, or you can connect with me offline and I can answer any questions you have about that.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good run through of how landscaping works in terms of bylaws, et cetera. Unfortunately, we have to target things kind of forward facing when it comes to development and bylaws. However, in terms of landscaping, what the RDN has so far is I'm not sure if it's public yet, but we're working on a fire smart and water smart landscaping guide that'll be available as public information. And then there's also a lot of information out on the Fire Smart BC and Fire Smart Canada web pages that talk about how private properties can help landscape their homes. One of the pieces that we find that's difficult for residents is what to do with that material that you're trying to clear and manage. And that is something that has been a challenge for us. And we're going to be looking for solutions on how to help the residents on that private property remove debris and dispose of the debris. But at this time, it is sort of kind of in some cases, we have to look to our residents as sort of a grassroots movement. So having people self-initialize, because there are limits to what the RDN can actually provide on private land. But yeah, if you have any more questions on landscaping or specific things that you can do on your property, feel free to connect with me.
I actually am working on some things in my community right now regarding fire smart and wildfire prevention and protection with Willow Bloomquist. I've applied for a small neighborhood grant and I'm working towards a community cleanup in the spring of 2022 prior to sort of the threat of all the while, as you said earlier, it's kind of odd that, we're having this conversation during these crazy weather events, but this isn't going to go away. And I'm pleased that, you're working towards this. I'm really sad that there were only 4 participants and 2 of you are from the RDN. But note to self, I'm wondering how this information was shared with, the community. It would have been nice to have seen more of this information, like in a local paper and other means to kind of get to know what was going on. Personally, it's great to see that the RDN is, taking some action, but there's a lot of new development that is happening in this community. And the fact that there isn't sort of some guidelines in place is kind of worrisome. Because, you're developing lots, especially in the Meadowood and Ashling street areas in this community. So how, as community members, what can we do to approach the RDN and say, look, this development is happening. There should be some guidelines in place because it's a clean slate. And if we're trying to plan ahead and be proactive to take care of our community, these guidelines should happen sooner than later.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So I can certainly agree that that's one of those frustrating points. And in some respects, I don't really know what the right answer is for you right now, but I can ask around a little bit. One of the first things I would do would be getting in touch again with Willow, which is awesome that you've done that already, and the local fire department, but also getting in touch with your electoral area director. That's an opportunity for you and members of your community to actually talk to the elected officials, because they're the ones that make those final decisions about what happens in bylaws. They're the ones that are passing those decisions. So if their community is voicing a concern about something so significant like this, that's an additional kind of pressure that you can put on them to say, hey, we want you to represent this particular issue in our community. The work that we're doing with the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan, unfortunately, has this kind of very slow timeline anyway. And we have internal policies that we have to follow that can't expedite things like changing a bylaw or amending a development program. So our hands are tied in some respects, but again, that's something I can look into and find out a little bit more about how the process works and if there is a way to potentially get support for those new developments. Unfortunately, because they've already applied for, many of them will have already applied for their permits and things like that, and they've been approved, they would have been approved and accepted. There's not much more enforcement we can do on our end, but again, certainly for future planning, that's going to be included in the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan. And again, I would encourage you to reach out to your local elected official to provide that support, or rather to provide that kind of community representative piece that they can then take to the board of directors and say, hey, this is something we need to look at a little bit more in our community.
That's really great advice. And I just moved into the community in June, actually during the heat dome. So I don't know who my elected officials are because I'm unfamiliar with this area. However, I am on the board of the Meadowood Park and Community Association and working with Willow, but I'm not sure who the politicians are in the area. So if Caitlin, if you could provide that, I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, you bet. I'm also fairly new to the area, so I'm gonna Google them.
Well, okay, fantastic. And Karen,
Yes.
Nice to meet you as well. Sorry, I am so used to being in a community when I'm doing Zoom. I don't usually use my video because it does cut into delays and such. I used to live in Port Renfrew, so living in a rural community is kind of familiar to me. But yeah, I'm happy to meet you and be in this neighborhood, and I love where we're living, and I'm really excited about being involved in kind of doing what I can to be proactive. And Willow's been fantastic. So
if I could make a comment on your concern, while you're new to the community, I'm not. I've lived here for 22 years and played a big role in getting fire protection up here. And we worked with the developer, Wicklow West, who owns that piece of property on Ashling that they're developing. They donated, for example, the property that the fire hall stands on and the property that the new community center stands on. They helped with water tank placement. They gave us the access into Little Qualicum River Falls Provincial Park from Meadowood. They're very open to community concerns and issues. And so approaching Wicklow West might be another avenue of getting them to look at what's happening in that development.
That's really great advice. Thank you.
I have a couple more questions. Matt, when you were talking about the high-risk areas of Meadowood and Whiskey Creek, you used a term called lower feasibility, and I can't remember the exact sentence, but I just didn't understand what that meant.
Sure. So that would have been in reference to the potential for fuel management. So fuel management being that process where a professional forester goes out and makes an assessment as to whether it's possible to go into an area and remove a substantial amount of the smaller trees and the understory trees in order to reduce the wildfire behavior that you would expect in that forest stand. So feasibility, what I meant by feasibility in that context is simply some things that make it less feasible to do fuel management are a lack of existing access. So if an area doesn't have existing road access, then it becomes very difficult to do. Steep slopes, obviously, make it very difficult or can make it quite difficult to conduct fuel management in an area. The presence of waterways, sort of the local geography. So, and this is why, so the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan itself doesn't, like it identifies areas where we can investigate fuel management, but it doesn't actually say, okay, this is going to go ahead here. You know what I mean? So it kind of says, here are a bunch of areas based on our preliminary understanding of the ground. It might make sense and it might be possible to do fuel management here to improve wildfire behavior. But now we need to go on the ground and explore a bit more to see if something can be done. And that's sort of the process that the RDN is in right now on Gabriola Island with this 707 community park that I mentioned. So there was a prior plan in that area that showed an like this resiliency plan, an area of higher wildfire threat, and the RDN decided, okay, it might make sense to go in there and investigate whether it makes sense to do fuel management. And in that case, they decided that it could make sense to develop a prescription because access is relatively good and it's relatively flat ground in there, and there aren't really many water courses or protected habitat features or any of that kind of stuff. So feasibility is really about it's sort of an estimate of how possible it might be. Yeah. And
so then you're saying that in these two areas the possibilities are low.
So I think the possibilities, they both have their drawbacks, but they also, being the primary areas of high risk, might be worth investigating. So they're obviously different. So Meadowood, of course, the area of high threat is likely to be low feasibility just because of the slope and because of the difficulty to access it for that reason. In Whiskey Creek, the situation is a little bit different. That one's potentially of higher feasibility, but lower usefulness because it won't buffer up immediately against homes. So I don't know exactly where yet we will be recommending fuel management, but part of the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan is essentially throwing some lines down on a map and saying you should try to investigate fuel management here. So there will likely be a couple of those areas around Meadowood and Whiskey Creek because of the high threat, but I don't know exactly what they look like yet.
Okay, and my second question is, and thank you for that explanation. Matt. My second question is, when you're evaluating risk,
Yeah.
I appreciate the consideration of the fuels. Do you consider the accessibility of water at all?
So that's a really great question. So the risk modeling that we do doesn't specifically consider the accessibility of water for firefighting purposes. So the risk modeling that we do is mainly looking at the wildfire threat, which is that combination of fuels, topography, and fire season weather, intersecting with basically a proximity from homes. Like the province has a map of where everybody's home is. So it doesn't look specifically at firefighting resources in the modeling. However, we do look at firefighting resources in the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan at large. And if we have good information from the local fire departments, which in many cases we do, they've been forthcoming with their information about where they have tanks and stuff like that, then we can sort of factor that into where we recommend potential fuel management or other actions. So if we know that an area has no practical source of water for firefighting, then potentially it might make more sense to recommend that area for fuel management if it is a high threat forest.
Okay, thank you.
And I can jump in on that one a little bit as well. So there are limits to what we can do in terms of like water feasibility studies. So for example, sometimes people ask us if, putting in new fire hydrants is a piece of the CWRP, or figuring out how many of our water lines work. So that is not necessarily we consider it in a general framework in the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan, but we're not actually doing a water feasibility study where we're going down to every fire hydrant and testing how much water flow it has and so on and so forth. It's more looking at what infrastructure do we have, and is it usable for the fire departments at this time? And if there are limits to it, how can we kind of circumvent that problem and solve it with another resource like a fuel management? Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah. You don't have to search too far for fire hydrants in Meadowood though, because there's only a few inside Little Qualicum River Village and there aren't others. So
yeah, and that's totally, it's kind of one of those things that it is unique about your areas. There are kind of limits to the water resources. And so it's something that we absolutely consider, but the CWRP is going to be focusing more on like, okay, if there isn't water availability, what else can we do?
Yes.
Then, adding to those resources is something that might be mentioned in the Community Wildfire Resiliency Plan, but actually establishing new infrastructure and kind of like those big capital projects is a bit outside the scope.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
No worries.
Great question. It's just the two of you. So do either of you have any more questions?
Just the two of us. Oh, wow.
I guess just opportunities for funding or means to kind of get the word out to other members of our community, because sometimes that communication piece just seems to be a little bit challenging. So is it possible to do a mail out, like a direct mail out to members of this particular high risk area? Where you can send out a brochure about, wildfire protection and prevention. I know that BC Wildfire has actual books available on landscaping, opportunities, things that people can do, like homeowners can do. So, perhaps is there a means to sort of have the RDN link with BC Wildfire, smart communities or whatever, to get the information out, because knowledge is power, and that's kind of like a huge opportunity. Obviously, for some reason, people weren't aware of a particular presentation tonight, which is unfortunate, because it was,
valuable, and you took the time to explain some stuff, and it would have been a great opportunity to share more information. So how can, the RDN and us provide opportunities to share important information, with the community?
Well, I can speak to that again. In terms of this particular information session, I have to admit I am a little disappointed as well. We did do several publications in the local newspapers as well as on our social media channels. So, that part is kind of tough, especially during COVID times. We have a lot of people that don't want to participate because it's Zoom. So if you have any ideas about how to get these kinds of informational sessions out to the public even more, I'm always willing to take suggestions. But like I said, we have a public engagement policy, and it's one of those things where we try to get it to everybody. And unfortunately, sometimes our channels just aren't enough. So I will certainly be promoting some of these ideas and follow-ups for residents to be able to view these sessions afterwards. In terms of future things like mailing out some of those pamphlets, that's something that I might have a conversation with some of our departments. We've kind of tossed around the idea of what's mail that everybody gets all the time, and everybody gets their tax forms. So perhaps that's an opportunity for us to, throw in a couple pamphlets on FireSmart to include that in their taxation forms that come out every year. I have a huge stash of FireSmart materials. If you'd like to coordinate,
I would, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to give you some. I have way too many, and I'm always trying to give them away. So if you or anybody that wants a stack, I can always bring them to you. And I know Willow has a bunch as well, and I can always get more to her at the local fire department as well. So we can coordinate that if you want those over the next little while. I might be a little busy with flood, so I might not be able to deliver anything to you, but yeah, please do reach out to me by email if you want some of those materials, and I can always hook you up.
I will, absolutely. I mean, a lot of that information is available online, but I think sometimes having a publication in a simple format is really helpful, because it allows people that kind of takeaway to sort of sit down and really absorb it. I mean, we spend a lot of time in front of our computers, and having to download stuff and that things isn't always ideal. And also too, not everybody is savvy with the computer, and so I think getting this information out specifically to my community and this area is at a very high risk threat. And yeah, so I take this to heart, and want to do what I can. And I'm retired, and was in civic life for a long time, so I recognize making those community connections is paramount. And so yeah.
Yeah, and Matt, I was also going to ask you a question too. Do you know where it falls in the funding streams in terms of things like doing direct mail outs?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry. So yeah, direct mailouts would fall under the education. I'm actually just looking up the program guide here to make sure that I'm not quoting an incorrect figure. So there is money available for the promotion and distribution of FireSmart educational materials and resources, which I would assume includes the pamphlets, which you can order for free from FireSmart Canada. I believe anybody can do that, but it could be coordinated by the regional district, and you're able to there's a limited amount of money. I'm not sure that it is enough money to get you through a direct mail out it might be enough for Meadowood. I don't know. But it's so there is a limited amount of money available for that kind of activity. Yes. Yeah.
So if I can jump in here, I think that would be a waste of resources. I think the best way to deal with people in rural communities like this is to have grassroots efforts of people in small neighborhoods who go out, like Diane and perhaps me, who would go out and hand deliver and talk up the fact that we are in a high risk area. I think that's much more effective than doing a general mail out, because it'll all just end up in recycling bins. And I think it's a waste of resources, but having a group of people who want to volunteer to disseminate the information that, hey, we live in this whole in Area F, we live in the highest risk area along with Whiskey Creek. That's a huge piece of information. And I know there's a perception about, for example, when Willow was coming around doing assessments on individuals' homes, we were one of the first that she did. And I started to phone everybody and say, you know, you should have this done. It's really a valuable tool. And people were all concerned that it would be used against them. Their risk evaluation would be used against them on their house insurance. And so there was a complete misunderstanding about what the purpose and outcome of this assessment was. And so a lot of people turned her down because they were afraid that if they had a high risk, their insurance would go up or be canceled. Or so being able to go in and say, no, that's not the case, and talk to people on a one-to-one rather than, you know, a brochure that people are going to put in the garbage.
Yeah. I hear your point, Karen. And so just to clarify, so it's not a specific, so the money that I would be available is available through this provincial program. So it's additional money that the regional district would apply for through a grant following the conclusion of the community wildfire resiliency plan. So I just want to throw that out there. There's a specific amount of money for basically acquiring and distributing fire smart educational materials, but you're not wedded to the mail out idea. So if there was a supportive, core group of community leaders in Meadowood, then theoretically in the future, something that could happen is RDN could coordinate getting a bunch of these materials delivered and then somehow ferry them over to you guys. Although I feel like Willow might be a better point of contact for that kind of transaction. And then you would be able to do that. I think it's absolutely amazing that in your neighborhood you have so many people who are educated about the issue and eager to sort of start working on it as part of a community effort. But I wanted to make clear that so the money is not tied to a specific mode of distribution. It's just there is money available through the provincial government to do this kind of work, to get the materials. Yeah.
And Willow is a great point of contact, but I know that she's really swamped with other duties and responsibilities within her own scope.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's important that people like myself and Karen and others, and even the, Meadowood Community Association, Cochrane Community Association is so important.
Yeah.
The mail out component was more about actually getting the information in specific boxes of people, because I mean, it is a large community to go out and go door to door to drop off brochures. But I think, like, as I know myself, education is power. And so the more that we can get this information in front of people to have an opportunity to sort of be alert, be aware, like prevention and, thinking ahead is really important. And I mean, especially now we have this time and these, resources, as you said, are available. It's kind of how can we best, navigate this system. Because I know that people, it is front of mind. I mean, especially, the summer that we just recently went through. And then, sadly, what's going on at present with the flooding is, we all kind of need to pool together and do what we can to kind of protect and preserve our community.
Yeah. And I also want to say that I really hear that nugget about people being concerned about tapping into a resource because it might affect how much money they have to put into something like their insurance. So I've definitely written that down, and I'm going to be looking for ways to make sure things like, doing a fire smart assessment. How do we communicate to people that it's a really good thing? No, it's not going to make your insurance go up. It's not going to, whatever. I'm going to put that in my arsenal because I think that miscommunication piece also spooks people. So I certainly respect that nugget. And also Diane too, about getting it in specific inboxes. I think that's kind of, I think where we need to come up with solutions about how to target specific small chunks of the community. And so, like you said, maybe that's, you know, at every Meadowood Association, community association meeting, that we make sure that there's a stock of Fire Smart pamphlets close by, so that anybody who hears about it can say, oh yeah, I can grab one of those things that we talked about at our last meeting or something. So I'm certainly always open to some of those like distribution ideas, and I can jump on those a little bit more quickly than perhaps having them kind of go through that more long process of having it put in the CWRP and then we have to act on it and so forth. So yeah, I definitely hear both of those pieces, and I think communication is key in this scenario. So I'll be adding those to my mental notes list for sure.
I have another point sort of that dovetails with this whole conversation, and we haven't mentioned them by name yet, but I am not sure if you guys have heard of the potential to form a neighborhood, or rather a Fire Smart recognized neighborhood. So, you know, if you manage to convince enough of your neighbors to sort of join you in this quest to improve fire prevention in a specific area, then there is opportunity for that to be a way to access additional money for things like Fire Smart awareness, education, and these community cleanup days, as Diane, you mentioned.
I'm actually working on that right now, and I just secured a grant through the Qualicum Beach Foundation, and so it's in the works, but I recognize that that's just a small component, and really we're talking 3 streets in my neighborhood. And so that was sort of the advisement that Willow and I, like when she reached out to me, we recognized that it's a big space and location. So if we can champion individuals, and she kind of corralled, well, we had a discussion and I agreed that this is something I could do, and I'm really grateful to be involved. But it takes time, and so that's good news to know that there's other resources available, because it does take time and it does take small amounts of money. But, you know, if we're not struggling, you know, to get this information out, to enlist community members, to encourage people to participate, then that's half the battle, right? But that's something that I'm working on right now, and I do have plans. We've got a community cleanup planned for early spring, but I'm having a hard time just getting that information out to my own community. So we all kind of need to work towards, and that communication and education piece is paramount, because that's the only way we're going to get this message across. And I know that you have people's attention, but it needs to be something that is continuous, and it needs to be put in a way that people will pick up the information and recognize that, you know, small changes that one can do within their own properties can make a big difference.
Okay.
Is my mic still on?
Yep, you're with us.
So there are within Meadowood kind of 2 distinct communities, above the gate and below the gate. And we have a Zoom AGM coming up the first week in December, and I might be able to, I can't get on the agenda as an agenda item because the information has already been circulated, but I might be able to get on as an information piece at the end. It unfortunately is not a face-to-face meeting, so I can't have things available, but I certainly can, if I can get on as new business at the end, perhaps talk about this report and the fact that we are an incredibly high risk area and some things that we should consider doing. And so perhaps, Caitlin, I can email you about some print material and some suggestions outside of this meeting. this meets
Absolutely.
now.
Yeah, absolutely. Give me a holler. And I have like a big like resource list that residents like you guys can go to for more information. It just kind of like compiles everything in the right spot. And then if you want physical paper copies, I can get that to you, and any specific information. Again, right now is a bit tough because I'm in the middle of floods, so I might not be able to do a presentation like off the fly, but I do have some presentations that I'm able to provide. If it's a group that you think might benefit from even me doing a presentation, perhaps not in your AGM, but if they wanted to have a special presentation, I'm willing to do that as well to get more of this information out to the community.
Yeah,
So
I'm not suggesting that. I'm at this point, I'm just
Yeah.
suggesting that there might be an opportunity to reach at least the people in the above the gate area with some more information. And it perhaps is a little bit more grassroots because we have a shared affinity for being above the gate, even though there's no gate at the moment. But anyway, I will be in touch with you. Thank you.
absolutely, drop me a line anytime.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Karen. And Diane. Does anyone have, do either of you have more questions? Or we are?
I don't.
Okay.
I actually will be in touch with Caitlin just to get her up to speed with what's happening. And yeah, I appreciate your time. And you said that this information was recorded, so if somebody wanted to see this at a later date, they could do so.
Yes.
Yes, we'll be posting it to that Get Involved page where you signed up.
Okay.
And so we're going to be we've recorded all of the session, or we will be recording all of the sessions for each individual area. So again, it'll take me a little bit of time to put it up because I am a bit swamped right now, but I will be putting it up. And one of my thoughts too was to send an email to all of our registrants who registered for these, to just kind of be like, hey, here's where the video is. Share this with your networks. They can go there and watch the video as well.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate it. And
No
thanks,
problem.
Matt, for your presentation.
You're very
Sorry,
welcome.
Matt, just one more. Sorry,
Yes.
I just thought of another question.
Yeah, no,
Just
that's
out of
great.
Just out of curiosity, in the RDN, what are the other high-risk communities?
Oh, so, you know, that's an interesting question. So I sort of talked a little bit about sort of the risk profile. A lot of the time, the risk is either driven by slope or it's driven by these sort of younger, denser conifer forests. So you have communities of both types in the regional district. You know, off the top of my head, some areas that have maybe higher amounts of these younger, denser conifer forests include parts of Electoral Area H around Bowser, and also parts of Electoral Area C around Extension. And then when it comes to sort of the slope influenced risk, it's kind of the similar story along that sort of edge of the foothills south of Highway 19. But I do want to say, I think earlier, Karen, you used the word, you described Meadowood as an extremely high risk community. And I want to just maybe give you a bit of courage and say it's not as bad as all that. It's not you know, like fire is going to happen tomorrow. But you know, I would hope that the lesson from sort of the updated risk mapping, it just shows that there are some areas where you could expect more intense fire behavior. And so where we've identified those areas, we're going to do our best to try and address specific recommendations. But it doesn't mean that, you know, Meadowood is as close to burning down.
Oh, touch wood, Matt, touch wood,
Yeah.
please.
I am. My desk is wood. Yeah.
Okay, don't ever make a statement like that without
I
touching.
know. Yeah.
Okay, bye.
So,
Thank
yeah,
you very much.
Thank you
Yeah,
guys
thank you so much, you
much.
guys.
Okay, bye-bye.
Good night.